And so, for that reason, I never learned French. I ended up getting married to a Spanish speaker from El Salvador, so that's what I now speak, Salvadoran Spanish, which is basically Spanish with not as many nice words. And I also appreciate the south of the border comment. I thought that was awesome. I haven't thought of myself as being south of the border. That's great. I will keep that in mind. So, because I only know one of you, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on a personal introduction, just because I think when people go to talks, they try to remember, they leave the talk and they don't know what they should remember. And so I'll tell you right now what I want you to remember about me years from now. That is, if you have Navajo things, you met a guy who cares a lot about the Navajo Nation. That's really my most important message. I also randomly care a lot about El Salvador because of my wife, but I do mostly work on the Navajo Nation. I'm Biligana, which is the Navajo word for, it's translated by my dad's wife, who is Navajo, as white, the other, or the enemy. And I like the last one the best. Now, my total exposure to Canada's Aboriginal law came from a guest speaker, and that's it. So I will apologize for that, but this is very US-centric paper talk. But before I get started on that, I did want to say a couple more notes about Larry's, which I think a lot of us are talking about, or have things to note. One is, in the US, they're now requiring some bars, you have to take Indian law, and do Indian law when you take the test to be a lawyer. And after they did that, some of the commercial databases have now put tribal law onto those databases. So Westlaw has it, and it's becoming much more accessible. And when some of those tribal courts do it, they still have the part in, as I said, I have mainly Navajo Nation, so they'll still have the part in Navajo in the opinion, and so the non-Indians can't necessarily read that. But it's there, it's much more accessible now because of that. And tribal courts are also getting better at having their own tribal court website so that there'll be PDFs or other sort of searchable databases for. That's very promising, I think, for this. The last paper I did, I spent actually, since getting this invite, much more time working on a book review of a book that was mentioned already, The Navajo Courts, which was written by a former justice of the Navajo Nation, Ray Austin. And so if anyone's interested in that, I'm happy to email that out. One thing, though, I wanted to add to, or talk about with regard to Larry's comments was the way in which these tribal court practices can be used to reject the sovereignty denial of the state. So the Navajo court does a good job of using tribal court law, or tribal law, and tribal court practice to reject some of the doctrines coming from the U.S. Supreme Court, which is less friendly towards tribal sovereignty. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about, though, is not that. It's about what to do when, largely, it's just an observation, which is when Indian Health Service, the way health is provided in the United States for Indians is through Indian Health Service. It's our only public free health service, as everyone knows. And IHS hospitals are poor quality. Typically, the spending by the government on IHS service per tribal member is lower than the subsidy that those of us paying insurance receive from the government as well. But that being said, it's free health care, which non-Indians do not have. IHS, though, is a federal government agency, and so since the Indian Self-Determination Act, there's been a move to have tribes take over some of these IHS hospitals and other services. And so, largely, I got interested in this sort of topic because I noticed the split between what happened with regard to housing and what was happening with regard to health. So in housing, the federal government also provides housing subsidies to tribes. It's the only place in the U.S. where new units are being built. So HUD, which is our housing entity, HUD's new money that goes into HUD is now actually reducing units because they rehab and they do other programs which diminish the total number of units available to the poor. The only place where new units are being built for the poor is on reservations, and the number of units is increasing, and that's through the NAHASDA funds. Sadly, Obama just reduced it 17% in the newest budget, but nevertheless, NAHASDA's been a fairly successful program It's been exactly what self-determination I think is geared to, which is tribal takeover of a project formerly being done by the federal government. Tribes have been more efficient overall, and the number of units being produced with the same amount of money when it's in tribal hands is greater than the number of units being produced in federal hands. Partly this is because tribes are doing things like building appropriately for and building the way in which they had done traditionally, or taking in some of those traditional practices into the way in which they constructed housing. And when the HASDA happens, there was not much controversy about tribal takeover of housing provision. Even though tribes could have left it with the federal government, they didn't. Didn't really took it on, and it's been successful. Now, when IHS takeover occurs, it's a much different story. So with Indian Health Service, when a tribe wants to take over a hospital, there's often tribal resistance from tribal members who do not want that to happen. And so that disconnect, I thought, was interesting. And on the Navajo Nation, which I've said is my primary focus, the tribal council wanted to take over health services, and they put it for a referenda, and the people, in a vast majority of people, rejected that effort of the tribal council. They said, no, we want to leave it with Indian Health Service. The tribal council, though, was not satisfied with that and has found a way around the will of the tribal members. And they've done that by delegating the permission or right to take over from IHS to nonprofits, who then take it over from IHS in the name of the tribe. Why would the tribal council do this even if the people don't want to? I think it's largely the contract support costs which go with this. So if you have a hospital being run and it's an Indian Health Service hospital, the back office support is out of DC or out of BIA or not BIA, but IHS offices. But when a tribe takes over a hospital, they then get not only the hospital, but they also get money to support the tribal bureaucracy. And that's not, I say that, and I don't think that's necessarily negative. It's a good thing to switch jobs from Washington, D.C., where I am, to Window Rock or to wherever the tribal leadership is. So that's the positive spin on it. But the negative spin is they are doing something that the tribal members don't want, and they're doing it largely to enhance the power of the bureaucracy or the central government of the tribe. And the other, I think, interesting aspect about this tribal takeover is the degree to which tribal members are not having a say in this. Or why is it that tribal members care about it still being with IHS? And I think there's two ways to think about it. One is they're afraid of failure, but where are they afraid of it? I think they're afraid on both sides. One is tribal government failure, and the other is U.S. government failure. So on the tribal government failure side, generally, at least in my, as I said, I only really know U.S. Indian law, there's a big push among Indian scholars and advocates to sell the successes that are happening on reservations or among tribes. So the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development and others, their message is we should talk about what works. And we shouldn't necessarily talk about what doesn't work. And the reason we shouldn't talk about what doesn't work is that, unsympathetic ears or eyes are going to look at these things, and so we shouldn't share this with people that could diminish sovereignty. And I guess part of my question here is, well, is that always true? Or should we, at some point, we acknowledge what people on the reservation know, which is that there are often problems in these tribal governments, and should scholars play a role in both highlighting or being the gadfly for tribal governments? And so here, I think there's no question that tribal members have a legitimate reason to be nervous about the Navajo Nation taking over these projects. Not to say that the U.S. government's any better, but they are aware of the problems on the tribal side. And then the other source of stress, I think, on this is if once it goes into tribal